Welcome to another installment of Thanatology Up-to-Date. With me again today is the Swiss doctor and thanatologist Reto Eberhard Rast. Today we have a particularly exciting question to discuss, namely whether near-death experiences also existed and still exist in pre-state tribal societies. We know the typical elements of a near-death experience from modern societies: a penetrating sound, the tunnel experience, an experience of light, the experience of all love and all knowledge. So the question is there anything comparable in earlier societies? Let's start with a path to the afterlife. What might it look like? Do we know anything about it at all?
I have to say something in advance about this question. One difficulty is that we know very few cultures today that can really be described as pre-state. For example, those that have no writing and no modern life. The little that we know about near-death experiences from such cultures comes from a time when the term near-death experience was not even known. But there were people, especially missionaries, who were active in tribal societies and wrote down experiences that were reported to them. Based on the elements they documented, we can now characterize these experiences as near-death experiences. There are also known experiences from the present day, but there are very few. Most of the reports from tribal societies are old. I wanted to say that in advance. So now to your question about how experiences that we document in Western cultures manifest themselves: a sound leaving the body, perhaps the experience of a tunnel. It seems that these experiences are more complex in non-complex societies than in modern societies. In societies with a simple pre-modern structure, everyone has a specific task that they have taken on. So there are no highly complex structures in coexistence as there are here. Now it seems that precisely this path to the afterlife is experienced as relatively complex. Compared to Western societies, it doesn't seem to be as easy to get there. It's not as quick, it's more arduous. It's not simply a matter of going through a tunnel. There is often work behind it. You might have to fight your way through a forest, you might have to defend yourself against beasts or demons. Or you simply have to deal with terrain that is difficult to access, a mountain or a rock face that you have to overcome. Only when you have overcome this hurdle do you reach the afterlife. Water can also play a very important role. In Africa, there are often reports of a lake. Below this lake, we find the ancestors, the members of our own tribe who have already died. This is where the afterlife lies. It is therefore necessary to dive into this lake, sometimes even through a cave underwater, or even enter a cave at all. The Maoris on New Zealand are also interesting when it comes to water. There are several reports of near-death experiences in which it is described that someone has to jump off a cliff into the sea at the northernmost point of the island, which must play a role in this culture in order to enter the afterlife. This allows them to enter the world of premonitions.
So what does the experience of the afterlife look like even in pre-state cultures?
To put it simply, it often seems to be a little more sober compared to Western near-death experiences. We are used to hearing reports of an exhilarating, liberating light in which the near-death experiencer wants to remain. We almost expect this from a near-death experience. This experience of light also exists in all tribal societies, in Africa, even in Indian cultures. This experience is not alien to them, but you can also say that things are clearly not always so happy over there. As an example, I would like to cite the experience of a Tlingit Indian from Alaska. He first has to cross a wilderness, then finds a path. Then he is faced with a choice. There are several paths, and he takes a relatively wide, well-trodden path. Then he comes to a river. This river consists of the tears of the bereaved, a bitter taste. They take him across, and when he's over there, he arrives at his ancestors, but they are in a pretty miserable state. He is then given something to eat, but the food smells burnt. He is given something to drink. It tastes bitter. And the people aren't particularly happy either. They don't like where they are. And he says, if it looks like this, then I want to go back. The others try to convince him, "Why don't you stay here?" But it doesn't stop him. He even says, "I'd rather die completely, rather be wiped out than experience something like this." So he crosses the river again, sees a fire far away, finds a sword, and wants to throw himself into the sword to kill himself. He does, and then he wakes up again. But his body is already in the tomb and has probably been clinically dead for 2 or 3 days. But he wakes up and comes back with this experience. He definitely didn't like it over there. There is another report from a Tiglat Indian. He also described a relatively gloomy afterlife. He comes to a village, and in this village, the people are freezing. Everything is in a miserable state. And he realizes with astonishment that some people are freezing even though there is a fire, but they are not sitting by the fire like many others. Why is that? Why are only some people sitting by the fire and the others are sitting far away and freezing? Then the question is answered. They weren't cremated when they died, they were buried. But those sitting by the fire may be warm, but they are also complaining because they are hungry. Interestingly, this hunger has to do with other people who are still alive. They do not care enough for the deceased. Such reports show everywhere in pre-state cultures, ancestor worship is something very important. Someone encounters their ancestors in their near-death experience, but these ancestors are not satisfied because those still alive do not take enough care of their ancestors. They give them too little to eat, do not provide the food as a sacrifice, mourn the deceased, and thus burden them. Of course, one can ask to what extent such near-death experiences are culturally influenced, or to what extent they are influenced by the clergy. Well, clergy is probably the wrong term, but there were shamans who were probably also interested in preserving religious beliefs. And the cult of the dead was certainly important. Of course, you have to take that into account. Such reports of near-death experiences could be falsified because the shamans were interested in people practicing their death cult. Corresponding ideas were then incorporated. We don't know for sure. The experiences happened too far back.
Could the comparatively image-intensive experiences perhaps also have something to do with the fact that there is no writing in these societies?
I don't believe that so much. I think it's more likely that these people's world of experience is very close to nature, including the dangers. We lack that. We are practically no longer used to danger. One small danger, and there is a big commotion. I think they lived with much greater dangers. But the intensity of images and the intensity of life, a particularly intense reality, is reported by near-death experiences in today's societies, just as it was in earlier tribal societies.
At the end of near-death experiences known to us, there is always the step back into the physical body. Why do people in pre-state societies go back? What do we know about the typical triggers?
To summarize briefly, when people experience themselves over there, they often come up against a boundary. It's always described that way, but in tribal societies, there is an additional element that I find very exciting, because we hardly recognize it in this form in Western society. There is not necessarily a boundary in the true sense of the word that must not be crossed, but it is about not being allowed to eat. That is the boundary. The Tlingit Indian who eats something is the exception, because in most near-death experiences, this element occurs in the form, if you eat with us now, if you sit at the table with us, if you eat this food, then you have to stay here, then you can't go back. This is a topos that we find not only in Africa where it occurs relatively frequently, but also in other pre-modern cultures. Conversely, this element also occurs. I know of a near-death experience in which someone was shown a tree. He said it was like Adam and Eve. If you eat the fruit from the tree, you immediately have to go back into your body. The return is of course only interesting if, as in this case, it was also beautiful in the afterlife, then you don't want to partake of these fruits. Apart from that, there is often the decision, or, if it is not possible to decide for oneself, the order to turn back. The voluntary decision is very similar to near-death experiences as we know them. It may be that someone does not want to leave their own children back on Earth alone, or you may be told for moral reasons you have to go back because you have to do this or that. I know an example from Africa where it was said, there are so many orphans, you have to look after these orphans, or we will now show you medicinal plants. You go back with this knowledge and show it to the people. These can be moral tasks. I know funny incidents from near-death experiences in Hawaii and Angola. The reason for not being allowed to stay in the afterlife was a kind of unworthy cause of death. The near-death experience from Hawaii dates back to the 19th century. I believe it's where a woman dies of an orgasm and goes to the afterlife. It's very nice there, she actually wants to stay, but says, no, a cause of death like that is not possible. So she comes back, regains consciousness. A similar, but then much more tragic report comes from Angola, from about 1870, as reported by a missionary. A woman was to be ritually executed in a kind of magic cult. She dies, is clinically dead. Then she is told over there, no, you are naked, that's not possible, and then she comes round again. And a very special near-death experience, which is difficult to categorize from a Western perspective, from the context we are used to, comes from Africa. Someone was sent back, at least that's how he told it himself, after experiencing something wonderful in the afterlife. And he is only allowed to return to his premonitions when he kills someone. Apparently, he actually fulfilled this task and died in prison. It is difficult to judge what this man really experienced. It may have been like this. On the other hand, the afterlife is very present in African societies. He could have simply have used it as legitimization. This was my job, I had to kill this person. We don't know. Both are conceivable. But of course, the incident is completely out of the ordinary. I have never heard of such a justification a second time, and near-death experiences are certainly not normally associated with murders.
Near-death experiences have only been a topic in our society for a few decades. This means that it is now possible to talk about it openly and relatively taboo-free. What is known about society's reaction to such reports in pre-state cultures? One might assume that people would be more open and less taboo about the subject of death than here. Is that the case?
That's a good question, but there is no general answer. We see a great polarity. There are cultures, for example, Polynesia, where relatively many near-death experiences are known from the past, where people are very open to such experiences and also manage to integrate them well into their lives. The question sometimes arises as to whether near-death experiences may even have led to the founding of religions. This is probably not the case with monotheistic religions, but I have come across a study that reports exactly that. There are two examples of this in Polynesia. We are not talking about large religious communities here, but about smaller groups whose founder had a near-death experience. They were able to refer to their experiences during the near-death experience and were accepted for this reason. Of course, this presupposes that near-death experiences are recognized in society, otherwise this would not be possible. But there is also the exact opposite. There are cultures, although I only know them from Africa, for example Madagascar, where it is exactly the opposite. People there are terrified of people who survive their presumed death in an unusual way, so afraid that they are even strangled. There are examples of people who got up again 2 or 3 days after they should have been buried, and then they were killed. This was because it was simply assumed that it could only be witchcraft if a dead person got up again. An evil spirit must have taken possession of this body and come back with it. People were very afraid of this. I even know of 2 near-death experiences from Nigeria that happened not so long ago. The near-death experiences had great difficulty convincing their relatives, for example, their own wives, that they were still the same after their return. People were extremely frightened. Of course, this presupposes the socially widespread notion of black magic, zombies and wizards. This is more widespread in sub-Saharan regions. This seems to have been less the case in Polynesia or among the Indians. I remember one incident very well. I was in Madagascar a few years ago as a doctor because of the plague. The danger that was attributed to the corpses, the plague deaths, was completely out of proportion to what was really appropriate. In fact, plague deaths posed little danger, but the government saw it differently and propagated it that way. For 20 years, a dead body was still dangerous. That was completely absurd. But I think this behavior goes back to a tradition. People are very afraid of the dead and the idea that the dead could return. Incidentally, this is the reason why people in cultures such as Micronesia, which is in Oceania, bury people very early, as soon as possible. They don't want to see them again. Once they are clinically dead, then away with them. A missionary who worked with a tribe in Nigeria, for example, reported around 1912 that a woman appeared at her funeral and accused the bereaved. "You killed me. I was still alive and you buried me." There are even examples from ancient tribal societies where the dying, if the death process dragged on too long, wanted to be buried themselves, even alive. They were even hit on the head with an object. Such customs probably have to be seen in context. In pre-state societies, someone who is very old and frail can be a great burden. At the same time, he naturally assumes that he will be able to continue living over there. He is convinced that he will now become an ancestor. In such cultures, I think death is viewed in a correspondingly relaxed way. There are also cultures in which people consciously retreat, for example, by going into the forest to die. Elsewhere, it is perhaps a little more violent, with the wish, "Now bury me or kill me." So the background to such a killing does not always have to be a fear of ghosts. But it is noticeable that where relatively fear-laden ideas prevail, there is also a certain willingness to use violence when it comes to the end of life.
What is your conclusion from all this? Does the modernity of a society have anything to do with the quality of near-death experiences?
The basic structure of the experiences seems to be global and independent of time. This applies to more or less all the basic elements of a near-death experience. But even if the spiritual content is comparable, we find differences to the experiences we know from modern societies. Certain groups of people have certain experiences. We find particular peculiarity in the experiences, even individually. There are also differences within the same culture. In this respect, it has to be said that near-death experiences are an enormous treasure trove of experiences that are always exciting to listen to, that are always very vivid, but certainly have a cultural imprint. And in addition to the cultural imprint, there is probably an even stronger individual imprint. Many examples have been documented from Western cultures Even with the same spiritual content and the same basic elements, near-death experiences vary enormously. We only have a few examples from pre-state cultures. It is therefore not possible to make a definitive statement.
Do you see anything that we could learn from pre-state cultures with regard to dealing with death?
In any case, it's good if we don't move in the direction that some cultures show, with their enormous fear of ghosts and the dead. That would be the wrong direction. But there is also the other direction that certain cultures have developed, which have a very relaxed, liberating, positive approach to the world beyond, to death, to passing on. For them, death is part of the reality of life. We could definitely learn from that.
Dr. Eberhard, thank you very much for these interesting insights. Thank you for the interview.